It started with nothing. No land, no tools, not even $1 to my name. Just me, dropped in the middle of the ocean. And somehow, I needed to survive. The first problem was obvious. I couldn't stay in the water, so I started swimming toward the only thing I could see on the horizon, a tiny island. When I finally reached it, it wasn't much. A few scraps, some trash, a broken boat, but in a challenge like this, trash is treasure. Because that junk, that was my very first opportunity. I sold everything I could find, the boat, the nets, even literal garbage, just to scrape together enough money for one thing, a fishing rod. And that changed everything. Fishing wasn't easy at first. I missed a lot of catches, lost fish. I pulled up more trash than anything useful. But eventually, I landed my first real fish. And this first $100, that was the moment things became possible. From there, it was a grind, fish after fish, hour after hour, slowly turning nothing into something. Eventually, I hit my first real milestone, $1,000. Now, I had a choice. Do I build a sell point or do I build somewhere to sleep? Because right now, I had neither, and both were a problem. But before I could even make that decision, I hit another wall. There wasn't enough land. The island was too small to build anything useful. So instead of progressing forward, I had to expand. Piece by piece, I started buying tiny patches of land, each one costing money I barely had. It felt painful, spending everything I earned just to create space. But eventually, I made just enough room to place my first major upgrade. A selling point. And just like that, I now had a place to sell things. Now, I could finally sell things properly, which meant I could start thinking about survival. So the next step, a place to sleep. Nothing fancy, just a small tent. But out here, that was everything, because for the first time since spawning in, I had a home. At this point, I had the basics covered, a way to make money, a way to sell, and a place to sleep. But there was one big problem left. Fishing just wasn't sustainable. If I wanted to actually thrive out here, I needed passive income. So I invested everything into my first production, a prickly pear. Simple, cheap, it only required water. Perfect in theory, except for one small issue. I had no way to get water to it. At first, I tried to do it manually. I got myself a dolly and a small water tank, and I tried dragging it around by hand. Let me tell you, it was a disaster. I got stuck, I lost control, had to reset everything. It was slow, frustrating, and honestly, not gonna work in the long term. So I went back to the grind, more fishing, more bonuses, more scraping together every dollar I could, until finally, I could afford something game-changing. A tractor. This was huge because now I had real mobility. I could move the water, I could move equipment, actually build something. And with that, everything started to click. I set up a better water system, I got the prickly pear fully running, and for the first time, I had something making money without me. And I didn't stop there. With the little money I had left, I placed a second one. Now I had 2 productions running, both generating income, both pushing me forward without fishing. And just like that, in a single day, I went from stranded in the ocean with nothing to building the foundation of a self-sustaining island. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't efficient, but it worked. And this is only the beginning. After 2 months on this island, things finally started to change. For the first time, I had something making money without me. The prickly pear harvest was ready. And when I sold my first batch, it was almost $2,000 from a single plant. That was it. This was the moment. This stopped being survival and started becoming a system. So naturally, I doubled down. But there was a problem. Space. There wasn't enough room on the island to expand. And expanding land? That's expensive. Painfully expensive. I spent almost everything I had just to carve enough space for one more prickly plant out. And just like that, I was broke again. $38 to my name. No safety net, no backup plan, just time. So I waited. Days turned into months, and the island was quiet. Too quiet. And when the next harvest finally came in, it wasn't what I was expecting. The price has dropped. A lot. What was almost $2,000 before was now barely $1,500. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about producing goods. It was about timing the market. But I didn't have the luxury to wait yet. I needed to keep scaling. So I planted my third prickly pear. And that's when the real problem started. Water. Each one of these plants needed thousands of liters, and moving it manually, it was a nightmare. Trip after trip, getting stuck in the sand, fighting the terrain, just to keep things alive. It worked, but it wasn't sustainable. So I made my next upgrade. Not a machine, not a new crop, the ground itself. I flattened the land, I laid down grass, and suddenly, everything changed. Movement was faster, cleaner, controlled. For the first time, the island started to feel manageable. And with that, I optimized everything. Water pumps placed perfectly, routes tightened, efficiency improved. Now I could water multiple prickly pear plants at once. Less effort, more output. And finally, I had momentum. So I pushed forward, expanded again, added a fourth prickly pear plant, and then I made a decision that could change everything. I stopped selling. Instead of dumping my crops immediately, I waited months, letting everything stack. Because if the prices were bad, then timing was the key. And when October finally hit, it paid off. 14 crates, all sold at once. Over $30,000 in a single day. That was the biggest jump yet. And with that kind of money, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something real. So I took a risk. A new crop. Potatoes. More inputs, more complexity, more potential profit. At least that was the idea. But after everything was set up, after all the water, all the effort, the returns weren't worth it. The prickly pear was still king. So I pivoted again. This time, raspberries. Higher value, faster production, but there was one problem I didn't see coming. Wait, the harvest was too heavy to move, too heavy to carry, which meant every sale turned into a battle, pushing pallets through sand, getting stuck, resetting, trying again, over and over. Until finally, I made the sale $3,400 for a single load. High reward, but brutal effort. And that's when it became clear. The island wasn't the problem anymore. The systems were. If I wanted to keep growing, I needed better tools, better infrastructure, better logistics. Because right now, every step forward came with friction. And if that didn't change, this entire operation was going to collapse under its own weight. The island was finally making money, but there was a problem. Every dollar I earned came with more work attached to it. The prickly pears needed water, the raspberries needed seeds, the potatoes were piling up, and the more I expanded, the harder everything became to move. At first, that didn't sound like a huge problem until I tried doing it by hand. Dragging pallets through the sand, pushing seeds into place, fighting the island every step of the way. This wasn't farming anymore, this was a battle against logistics. And if I didn't fix it soon, the island wasn't going to grow. It was going to bury me. So before I could think about another crop, another production, or another big expansion, I needed one thing: better tools. But tools cost money. And out here, money still didn't come easy. So I did what had worked before. I waited. I kept everything watered, kept the productions running, kept squeezing every dollar I could out of the island. And then finally, October arrived. The prickly pears were ready, and this time, I had a lot more than before. Crate after crate, load after load, all of it built from the system I had slowly been piecing together since the very beginning. And when the first sale came in, it was almost $12,000 from one load. But that was only the start. By the time the last crate was sold, I had over $46,000. For the first time ever, I wasn't scraping by. I had options. And I knew exactly where that money needed to go, because the biggest thing holding me back wasn't the crops, it wasn't the prices, it wasn't even the size of the island anymore. It was the fact that I still had no real way to move anything. So I bought a field service kit. It wasn't flashy, it was basically just a toolbox. But on this island, that toolbox changed everything, because now I could finally modify my tractor, and that meant I could add something I had needed for a long time: a front loader. Piece by piece, I bought the setup, the loader arms, the adapter, the pallet forks, and when it all finally connected, the tractor became something completely different. Not quite a forklift, but close enough. And close enough was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I could lift raspberry pallets instead of shoving them across the island like a maniac. It was still a little rough, still awkward, still not perfect, but compared to what I had before, it was a massive upgrade. And then I realized something. Even with the forks, the sand was still fighting me. Every turn, every load, every little movement. So I made one of the best upgrades of the entire challenge. I removed the sand. The whole island got covered in grass, and instantly, everything felt different. The tractor moved better, the pallets handled better, the island finally stopped feeling like it was trying to kill me. And it cost a few $1,000s, but honestly, I would have paid more. With the ground fixed and the tractor upgraded, the next problem was obvious. The little handcart had to go. It had carried this island through the early days, but those days were over. So I sold it for whatever sad little amount I could get back, and I replaced it with a real trailer. Nothing fancy, nothing huge, but compared to pushing everything around by hand, it was a revolution. Now I could move seeds in bulk, move potatoes in bulk, move harvests without turning every sale into a near disaster. For the first time, the island had real logistics. And that meant I could finally think bigger. Up to this point, everything I built was small. Small prickly pear plants, small gardens, small everything. Not because they were the best options, but because they were the only things I could afford. Now that had changed. I had money. I had tools. I had space. So I expanded the island again, smoothed out the new land, covered the sand, and placed the biggest production I had built so far: a large garden. This thing was different. It could grow a bunch of different crops, and it had two ways to run. It had the simple way, with just water, or the advanced way, with water, seeds, and fertilizer. The advanced recipe was more expensive, more complicated, more demanding, but it produced way more. And after everything I had just built, that was the whole point. I wasn't trying to survive anymore, I was trying to scale. So I chose peas. I loaded the garden with water, then seeds, then fertilizer, and just like that, the island had its first serious crop production. Not a tiny survival garden, not a desperate experiment, a real money-making system. And the timing was perfect because peas sold best in December, the same month as potatoes, which meant if everything worked, I was about to have the biggest payday the island had ever seen. So once again, I waited. The island worked quietly in the background. The potatoes stacked up, the peas grew, the raspberries kept producing, And when December finally arrived, it was time to find out if all this effort was actually worth it. The peas came first, and right away, I knew this was different. 7,000 liters all loaded onto the trailer, all from one new production. And when I drove it to the sell point, the money just kept climbing. $13,000, $16,000, $19,000, $22,000 from peas. That one decision, that one big garden, had already paid off. But I still had potatoes, a lot of potatoes, way more potatoes than I expected. Load after load went into the sell point. It wasn't the most valuable crop on the island, but there was so much of it that it just didn't matter. It all added up. And then I sold the raspberries too, another $10,000 by the end of it. I had over $56,000. This was the first time the island felt different. Not because I survived another year, not because I scraped together one lucky sale, but because the systems were starting to work together. The tractor could move pallets, the trailer could move volume, the grass made the island usable. The big garden proved that larger productions could actually work. For the first time, growth didn't feel impossible, it felt inevitable. But it also revealed the next problem. The old starter systems were beginning to look outdated. The small gardens, the constant watering, the tiny productions scattered around the island. They got me here, but they weren't built for where this was going. If this island was going to become something bigger, something cleaner, something that could actually survive long term, then the next step wasn't just making more money. It was rebuilding the island around better systems. Because now, I finally had the tools to do it. For the first time since arriving in the deep sea, the island actually felt like it had momentum. I had real tools, a trailer, a tractor that could move pallets, productions that were finally working together. And after the last big sale, I finally had money again. But the money on this island never lasted long because every time I solved one problem, the island revealed the next one. And this time, the problem wasn't space. The gardens were making money, the prickly pears were still producing, the peas had proven they could bring in a huge payday. But if this island was ever going to become a real farm, I couldn't rely on gardens forever. I needed a field, a real field, one I could plow, plant, harvest, and use to finally start growing crops the traditional way. The only issue was, building land in the middle of the ocean was unbelievably expensive. So before I bought anything else, I took the money I had and I started expanding the island. At first, it felt like progress. The land started rising out of the water, the island stretched outward. For a moment, I could actually picture it, a full field sitting right beside everything I had built. But then the money disappeared, fast. And when I stopped, I was left with a half-finished chunk of land and a very clear reminder that I was nowhere near done. If I wanted a real field, I was going to need a lot more money. So once again, the island had to go back to work. I watered everything, kept the gardens running, let the peas grow, the potatoes stack up, let the prickly pears keep doing what they had done from the beginning. And then I hit another problem. Production costs had pushed me into the negative. And because I had no money, I couldn't even refill the water tank. That meant the entire island was one step away from shutting down. So I had to make an emergency sale. The raspberries. They were annoying, they were heavy, they were a pain to move. But the price stayed steady. And right now, they were the only thing keeping the island alive. After loading them up and selling everything I could, I had enough money to get back above water. Literally. The tank filled again, the plants got watered, and the island started moving. But that moment made something very clear. I couldn't keep living sail to sail forever. If I wanted to build something bigger, I needed one massive payday. So I waited, month after month, keeping everything alive, moving products around, making sure nothing completely filled up. And by the time the next big selling window arrived, the island was packed. The peas alone had exploded over 43,000 liters. The potatoes were stacked high, the prickly pears were ready. Everything I had built was finally waiting to be turned into cash. And this time, I wasn't going to move at all with that tiny trailer. The little trailer had helped, but it was already too small. I was overloading it, stacking too much on it, trying to force it to do a job it was never meant to do. So I upgraded again, a bigger trailer, and this one changed everything. Because instead of stacking peas by hand, I could load them directly into the trailer. No pallets, no balancing act, no tower of vegetables ready to fall into the ocean. Just fill it, drive it, and dump it. The first big load of peas sold for $47,000. In one trip, that was the moment I knew the island had crossed another line. This wasn't survival anymore. This was expansion money. And after selling the potatoes, the prickly pears, and everything else I was willing to deal with, I had over $200,000. That was the most money I had ever had on this island. And for once, it felt like enough. So I went back to the land, and this time, I didn't stop early. I pushed the island further out, widening the space, built the foundation for the first actual field. And just like always, it cost way more than I wanted. By the time the land was shaped, smoothed, covered in grass, most of the money was gone. The island was bigger, but my bank account was almost empty again. And I still needed equipment. A plow, a cultivator, a planter, a harvester, a header. Everything required to actually turn that new land into a working field. So I had no choice. The raspberries had to go. They had made me money, they had kept the island alive, but they were also the most annoying production I owned. Too heavy, too awkward, too much effort for what they were giving back. So I sold off what was left, and then I got rid of them completely. No more raspberries. In their place, I built another large garden. Something cleaner, something easier, something that fit the direction the island was moving now. And since I already had peas running, I chose carrots. Peas and carrots, a perfect little combo. Of course, that new garden needed water. A lot of water, 60,000 liters. And even though I had dealt with a garden this size before, it didn't make the process any faster. 2,000 liters at a time, slowly filling another massive production that needed a ridiculous amount of water just to get started. By the time it was finally full, I was more convinced than ever that the island needed bigger equipment. But first, I had a field to build. I hooked up the plow, turned on field creation, and for the first time, started carving farmland into the island. This was the moment everything had been building toward, from fishing for a few dollars, to selling trash, to tiny gardens, to trailers, to bigger productions, and now, finally, a real field. But it was brutal. The tractor struggled. The field took forever. The sun went down and I kept working late into the night, pass after pass, row after row, trying to turn this chunk of ocean land into something useful. And when the morning finally came, there it was, the first field in the deep sea. It wasn't perfect. There were rough spots, missed patches, awkward edges, but it was real, actual farmland on an island that started with nothing. For a second, I just looked at it because this was a huge step. And then reality hit again. Plowing the field was only the beginning. I still had to cultivate it, and the little tractor was not built for this. It bounced, it struggled, it crawled across the field, and even though it technically worked, it was obvious this was not going to be sustainable. The island had outgrown another machine. So I made a decision. I could force the little tractor to keep going, or I could wait, let the gardens produce again, sell what I needed, and buy a tractor that actually belonged on this farm. So I waited. Again, the peas grew, the carrots came in, The prickly pears kept producing, and when March arrived, I sold just enough to make the next jump. 1 load of carrots and 1 load of peas. That was all it took. And with the money in the bank, I bought the machine that could finally turn this island into a real farm. A new tractor. Compared to the old one, this thing felt massive. More power, more weight, bigger tires. A real machine for a real field. And the second I drove it across the farmland, I knew it was the right call. The field didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt manageable. The island had officially outgrown its survival tools and started moving into real farming equipment. This was a different kind of progress. Not just another garden, not just another small production. This was infrastructure, land, machines, a field. The foundation of an actual farm. The little blue tractor had carried me through the early days. It moved water, pulled trailers, helped build the first systems that kept me going. But now, the island needed more than just survival gear. It needed power. And for the first time, I had it. The field was built. The new tractor was ready. The gardens were still making money, and the island was bigger than it had ever been. But building the field was only the first step. Now, I had to make it produce. Because if this worked, the deep sea island wouldn't just be surviving anymore. It would finally become a real farm. The field was finally built. After years of surviving in the deep sea with nothing but gardens, the island finally had real farmland. But building a field wasn't only the first step. Now I had to make it produce. Because a field with nothing growing in it is just another expensive piece of land, and after spending almost everything I had to build it, I needed this field to start paying me back. The plan was soybeans. They were valuable, they didn't take up a ton of storage space, and on this small island, that mattered. The only problem was I was almost broke again. I needed seeds, I needed fertilizer. I still needed to keep the gardens alive, and I didn't even have basic farm infrastructure yet. No silo, no equipment shed, no proper yard. Just tools and machines scattered around the island wherever they happened to fit. So, before I could plant anything, I needed money. The best-selling window was still months away, but I couldn't wait. If I missed the soybean planting season, this field would sit empty for another year. So, I made a quick sale. The prickly pears weren't at their best price, but they were good enough. I loaded everything I had, hauled it to the sell point, and brought in almost $14,000. It wasn't a massive payday, but it gave me just enough breathing room to keep moving. Then, I made another tough decision. The little blue tractor had to go. That tractor had carried the island through the early days. It moved water, pulled trailers, helped with pallets, and basically kept the whole place alive. But now, the new tractor had taken over, and I needed the money more than I needed a second machine. So, after a ton of months on the island, I sold it. It was sad to see it go, but it also proved something. The island wasn't built around survival tools anymore. It was starting to move into real farming equipment. With the money sorted, I watered everything one more time, kept the productions running, and waited for April. Because April was the month that would decide if this field was actually worth it. When morning came, it was finally time to plant. But before I got started, I looked around the island and realized something. This place was a mess. Tools were everywhere. Equipment was parked in random spots. And every time I tried to move around, I was dodging something. So I cleaned it up. I moved the seeder closer to the field, parked the tools together, and cleared a few paths. It wasn't a huge upgrade, but it made the island feel a little more like a farm and less like a pile of scrap. Then, right when I was ready to start planting, the weather turned. Hail started coming down hard, and for once, I was actually lucky I hadn't planted anything yet. There was no crop damage, no progress lost, just another delay. So, I waited. I bought the seeds, bought the fertilizer, loaded the planter, and watched the sky until the hail finally stopped. Eventually, the weather shifted into a light drizzle, and that was good enough. I pulled the planter onto the field, switched it over to soybeans, lined up the first pass, and started planting. For the first time ever, real crop seed was going into the ground on the deep sea island. Not a garden, not a greenhouse, not some tiny survival production. A real field. A real crop. The planter was small, the field was awkward, and the tractor struggled a little in the mud, but none of that mattered. By the time I finished, the soybeans were planted, and everything it took to get here, the fishing, the trash sales, the gardens, the water runs, the land expansion, and the plowing, the island finally had a traditional crop growing on it. That was a huge step, but it still wasn't perfect. The field was only halfway fertilized, and it needed lime. I didn't have the equipment for lime yet, but I could fix the fertilizer. So the next month, once the soybeans started growing, I bought a small spreader. It wasn't fancy, it didn't hold much, but it was cheap, and cheap still mattered. I loaded it with solid fertilizer, drove carefully onto the field, and gave the soybeans their second application. The field was small, so it didn't take much, and when I finished, the crop was fully fertilized. Not perfect, but good enough for the island's first real harvest. After that, all I could do was wait. Month after month passed. The soybeans kept growing, the peas kept producing, the carrots stacked up and the potatoes filled in. The prickly pears also kept doing what they had done since the beginning. Then finally, fall arrived. For most farms, harvest season is exciting, but for this island, it was historic. Because this wasn't just another pallet sale. This was the first real field harvest in the deep sea. I climbed into the harvester, hooked up the header, and got ready to find out if this had all been worth it. Of course, the island had one more delay waiting for me. Rain. Harvesting in the rain would cut into the yield, and with one small field, I needed every liter I could get. So I waited, and when the rain finally stopped, it was time. The harvester rolled into the soybeans, the header dropped, and the first crop from the first real field started pouring into the tank. It wasn't a massive harvest, it wasn't a massive field, but it was mine. And after years of surviving in the ocean, watching soybeans flow into the harvester felt like the island had crossed another line. This wasn't just survival camp anymore, it was becoming a farm. The harvest went smoothly, but as soon as it was done, I ran into the next problem. Storage. The soybeans had to go somewhere, and the only place I could put them was the trailer. The same trailer I needed to sell peas, potato, carrots, and everything else. So now my best hauling trailer was stuck full of soybeans and I had no way to unload it. That meant I had to go backwards. Back to the tiny green trailer, back to smaller loads, back to doing things the hard way. At least until I could afford a silo. Luckily, December was almost here, and December was the month everything on the island turned into money. The peas were ready, the potatoes were ready, the carrots were ready, and the prickly pears were ready. But before I could sell properly, I needed that silo. So I started with the peas. I loaded the tiny trailer, hauled them to the sell point, and hoped it would be enough. It was more than enough. That one sale pushed me up to $38,000. And with that, I built the island's first grain silo. It wasn't huge, but it fit, and for the first time, the island had real crop storage. I dumped the soybeans in, freed up the trailer, and finally got back to work. Now the real selling could begin. Peas, carrots, potatoes, prickly pears. Load after load went into the sell point. Months of productions all turned into cash, and by the time everything was sold, I had $173,000. Another massive payday. But the sales also made something obvious. The carrots just weren't worth it. The peas were better. They sold for more, they created less volume, and they were easier to move. On a tiny island in the middle of the ocean, easy matters. So I shut the carrot production down and switched it over to peas. From now on, this was going to be a pea empire. 2 large gardens, both producing the crop that made the most sense. Clean, simpler, more profitable. But there was still one big problem left. The island had real equipment now: a tractor, a harvester, header, seeder, plow, a fertilizer, and trailers. And all of it was still sitting outside. If this place was going to feel like a real farm, I needed a real building, a barn, somewhere to store equipment, somewhere to organize tools, and somewhere that made the island feel permanent. The only problem was space. Again, there wasn't enough room. So once again, I had to spend a ridiculous amount of money, not on crops, not on machines, but on land. I pushed the island outward, expanded the edge, made room for the barn, and watched the money disappear with every piece of ground I added. It hurt, but it had to be done, because the island couldn't keep growing without infrastructure. Once the land was ready, I placed the barn, and immediately it felt right. It matched the silo, it had wide doors, plenty of storage, even an upstairs loft. For the first time, the island had an actual farm building. Not a tent, not a greenhouse, not a survival setup, a barn. Of course, nothing was perfect. The harvester fit, but the header didn't. The sand around the building still had to be fixed, and the storage layout needed some work. But those were good problems, farm problems, not survival problems. And that was the real difference. By the end of the day, the first soybean harvest was finished. The soybeans were in storage, the silo was built, the gardens were switched over to peas, and the island finally had a barn. This was one of the biggest shifts yet. Because the deep sea island wasn't just making money anymore, it was becoming organized, structured, permanent. The field proved it could produce. The silo gave me somewhere to store crops. The barn gave the farm a real center, and the pea gardens were ready to keep the money flowing. But now that the basics were in place, the next step was obvious. More land, more crops, better equipment, and enough infrastructure to turn this tiny island into something that could actually last. Because the deep sea farm was no longer just surviving, it was finally taking shape. My first job was simple: keep the island running. The pea gardens had become one of the strongest moneymakers I had, but they were also hungry. They needed water, seeds, and fertilizer if they were going to keep producing enough to fund the next round of upgrades. So before I could build anything new, I had to restock what was already working. I started with water. The prickly pears were empty again, the pea gardens needed topping off, and even after all this progress, water was still one of those jobs that never fully went away. Once everything was filled, I moved on to the bigger problem: seeds and fertilizer. The pea gardens could hold a ridiculous amount of inputs, and if I wanted them to keep producing for the next few years, I needed to load them up now. That meant spending a lot of money before I made any money back. Seeds, fertilizer, bag after bag, stack after stack. And before long, the shop area was completely packed. I bought as much as I could afford, but even then, I didn't have enough money to get everything exactly where I wanted it. That was the strange part about this island. I was making more money than ever, but every upgrade cost more than ever too. So even with almost $50,000 in the bank, I still ran out. And then came the slow part: loading, hauling, unloading, trying to get thousands of liters of seeds into one garden, and then thousands more into the next. The little trailer helped, but it was starting to feel tiny. Just like every other tool on this island, it had been useful for the stage I was in before, but now the farm was growing past it. Still, I got it done. Both pea gardens were stocked with seeds. Both had fertilizer. Not perfectly even, not exactly how I planned it, but enough to keep them producing. And that was what mattered. The money was low again, But luckily, the prickly pears were ready. They had been with me from almost the beginning. The first real passive income on the island. The thing that carried me before the big gardens, before the field, before the silo, before any of this felt possible. And even now, they were still useful. I loaded up 15,000 liters of prickly pears, hauled them to the sell point, and brought in over $21,000. That sale gave me breathing room again. And with the gardens restocked, the island could keep running. Now the focus shifted back to the field. The first soybean harvest proved the field could work, but it also showed me the field wasn't being used properly yet. It needed lime. It needed weed control. It needed better preparation. The first harvest was good because it was the first, but if this field was going to become a serious part of the farm, it needed better yield. So when spring finally came around, I got ready for the next soybean crop, and immediately there were more problems. Weeds were already coming in. The field needed lime, and the equipment I had wasn't enough. I thought my spreader could handle lime. It couldn't, so I had to buy another tool, a dedicated lime spreader. It wasn't a massive purchase, but on this island, every few $1,000s mattered. Then I bought a weed or two, because I knew if I waited, the money would disappear somewhere else. And weeds were only going to become a bigger problem as the farm expanded. So now I had two new tools, a lime spreader and a weeder. Small upgrades, but important ones, because this was the difference between having a field and actually managing a field. Of course, the lime immediately turned into a problem. The spreader didn't fill the way I expected. The big bag didn't work. So I had to use smaller bags and dump them in by hand. It was awkward, it was annoying, and it was exactly the kind of thing this island loved to throw at me. But eventually I got it filled. Then I started spreading lime across the field, and it disappeared fast, way faster than fertilizer. Before I even finished, I had to go back and buy more. But once it was done, the field was finally limed. Not perfectly. There were still a few rough edges, but it was good enough. And the best part was, I wouldn't have to do it again for a while. With lime finished, I moved on to cultivation. The old cultivator was still small. The field still took time. But now that I was working real farmland again, every pass felt a little different. This wasn't just building the first field anymore. This was maintaining it, improving it, preparing it for the next real crop. After cultivating, I planted soybeans again. Then I used the new weeder to clean up the field, and even that felt like progress. For once, the job didn't take forever. The weeder was wider than most of the tools I had been using, and even though it still wasn't perfect, it made the work feel more manageable. By the time the sun went down, the field was cleaned up, the soybeans were in, the weeds were gone, and the island was ready for another growing season. Then I waited. The soybeans grew, the pea gardens worked in the background, the potatoes kept stacking, the prickly pears kept producing. By the time harvest season came around, the soybeans were ready again. I harvested the field, moved the crop into storage, and added it to what I already had waiting in the silo. And instead of selling the soybeans right away, I made a decision. I was going to hold them. The harvest from one small field wasn't enough to feel like a big sale. So instead of cashing in a little at a time, I started hoarding soybeans. One harvest, then another. Let them stack up, because eventually I wanted one big soybean payday. But the real money still came from the gardens. And when fall arrived, it was time to sell. The peas were ready, the potatoes were ready. The island had spent the whole year building toward this moment. I started loading peas and the money exploded. Trip after trip, sale after sale. The bank account climbed higher than it ever had before. And by the time the big selling run was done, I had over $340,000. That was unbelievable. For a farm that started with nothing on a tiny island in the ocean, $340,000 felt like a fortune. But I already knew it wouldn't last, because the island needed upgrades. Big ones. The first upgrade was land. Again, the island was getting crowded, the cell area needed more room, the barn needed better access, and if I wanted to build a real home, I needed space behind the barn. So I expanded the island outward, smoothed the ground, opened up the yard, and once again watched a huge chunk of money disappear. It hurt, but this was how the island grew. Every major step started the same way. Make money, spend it on land, create space, then build the next part of the farm. And this time, the next part was personal. After all this time sleeping in a tent, I finally built a house. Nothing huge, nothing crazy, just a small home on the edge of the island, with the ocean right behind it. But to me, it was massive, because this was the first time the island felt like more than a workplace, more than a challenge, more than a survival project. It felt like I had somewhere to live. I removed the tent, put down grass, added a fence, a gate, a few decorations, a little yard, a swing, a barbecue area, a small shed. And suddenly, this tiny island in the middle of the deep sea had a home. That was a different kind of progress. Not more money, not more crops, not a bigger machine. A sign that after all this time, I wasn't just surviving here anymore, I had built a life here. But the work wasn't done, because if the farm was going to keep growing, the equipment had to grow too. The old planter was too small. The old cultivator was too small. They had helped the first crop get in the ground, but they weren't built for the future. So I bought a bigger planter, twice the working width, more efficient, and still able to plant soybeans. Then I bought a bigger cultivator. Not the biggest one I wanted, because the tractor still had limits, but much better than what I had before. These weren't flashy upgrades, but they were the kind of upgrades that changed everything over time. Less time planting, less time cultivating, more time expanding, more time making money. And after buying the new equipment, I sold the old tools. The small seeder, the tiny cultivator. They had done their job, but the island had outgrown them. Just like it had outgrown the first tractor, just like it had outgrown the tent, just like it had outgrown the tiny survival systems that started all of this. By the end of the year, the island was almost unrecognizable. The pea gardens were stacked, the field had been limed, weeded, planted, and harvested again. The soybean storage was growing. The island had expanded, the tent was gone. A real house stood behind the barn, and the equipment was finally getting bigger. This place had started as nothing but a tiny piece of land in the ocean. Then it became a survival camp, and then a garden island, then a working farm. And now it was becoming something permanent. A farm with a home. A farm with systems. A farm with room to grow. And now it was time to use that room. The first job was fixing the field. When I expanded the island last time, I accidentally cut into one of the corners and I couldn't leave it like that. So I hooked up the plow, turned field creation back on, and started reshaping the edge. I wanted the field back to its original size, with the same rounded corner it had before. It took a few awkward passes, but eventually the shape came back. The missing corner was filled in, the rough edge was fixed, and the field finally looked whole again. Then I hooked up the cultivator and ran it across the field to get everything ready for the next soybean planting. With that done, I moved on to the next big job, clearing out the old productions. The potatoes had to go. They had been reliable, but they weren't making enough money anymore. So I saved what little product was left, sold the garden, and removed the pump. Then I moved over to the prickly pears. These were harder to let go of. They were the first real moneymaker on the island, and they helped build almost everything that came after them. But they were slow now. Small, outdated, and I needed the space. So I moved the last crates out of the way, sold the plants, cleaned up the pumps, and finally cleared out the front loader parts that had been sitting around doing nothing. By the time I finished, the island looked empty in a way that it hadn't in years. But that was the point. I wasn't clearing space because something failed. I was clearing space because something better was coming. The next morning, I used that space to place 2 more large gardens. The pea gardens were staying. They were still one of the best moneymakers I had, but these new gardens needed something different. So I went with grapes. 2 new grape gardens, sitting right where the old productions used to be. Now I had to get them running. First, I added the garden hoses so they could take water, and then I started loading inputs. There were a few leftover seeds and fertilizer bags around the farm, but not nearly enough. And almost immediately it turned into a mess. The trailer grabbed the wrong products. Seeds got mixed in with fertilizer, the lime kept getting in the way. So I cleaned up what I could, sold the leftover lime that was causing problems, and bought a big batch of seeds. Then I started hauling. Seeds into the first garden, seeds into the second, and then solid fertilizer. I couldn't afford to completely max everything out, but I loaded enough into both gardens to get them started. Then came the water. 60,000 liters for each garden. 120,000 liters total. 2,000 liters at a time. I filled the tank, drove over, dumped the water, went back, filled it again, and kept going until both gardens were full. It took forever, but when I finished, the grapes were finally ready to produce. Now the island had peas for December and grapes for May. That meant I wouldn't have to wait all year for one big selling window anymore. The farm had another major payday on the calendar. A few months later, I got to see if the grapes were worth it. When spring came around, the vines were full and the grapes were ready, and May was the perfect time to sell. So before I touched the field, I hooked up the trailer and started loading grapes. And right away, I knew this was going to be big. There were over 40,000 liters waiting in the gardens. The first trailer load sold for over $41,000. One load. That was all it took to prove the grapes belonged here. Then I kept going. Load after load went into the sell point, and by the time the grape sale was done, I had over $185,000 in the bank. And that wasn't even a full year of production. The grapes were already one of the strongest systems on the island. With that money secured, I went back to the field. It was already cultivated, so I just got right to planting. I checked for a bigger upgrade, but the tractor was still the limit. Most of the planters I wanted needed more horsepower than I had. So for now, the current planter had to stay. I filled it with seeds and fertilizer, lined up on the field, and planted soybeans again. After planting, I tried to fertilize right away, but the field wouldn't take the second application yet. So I waited one more month. In June, the soybeans had started growing. There were no weeds this time, and the crop was still young enough to drive over safely. So I hooked up the spreader, lined up the passes, and gave the field its second round of fertilizer. When I was finished, the field was fully fertilized. 90% yield bonus. Not perfect, but strong. The soybean crop was set. The grapes had already paid out, the peas were building in the background, and the island was running better than ever. Then I waited. The field grew, the gardens kept producing, the grapes started building toward the next spring, and the peas stacked up for winter. When November arrived, it was soybean harvest time. I pulled the harvester out of the barn, squeezed it through the tight doorway, hooked up the header, and got to work. The field still wasn't huge, and the header still looked tiny, but every harvest added to the stockpile. This time, the field gave me just under 5,000 liters. Not enough for a huge sale by itself, but that wasn't the plan anymore. The plan was to keep stacking soybeans until the sale actually felt worth it. So I dumped the crop into the silo with the rest and moved on, because December was here, and December meant peas. The pea gardens had been running all year, and when I checked the numbers, there were over 51,000 liters waiting. This was going to be huge. I started loading the trailer, then the sales began. Trip after trip, load after load. Everything the pea gardens had built over the year turned into money, and by the time the last load was gone, the bank account had climbed to over $559,000. Over $500,000. That was the most money I had ever seen on the island. But I already knew where it had to go. Infrastructure. The farm needed a real support area. Fuel, seeds, fertilizer, lime, storage. All the things I had been buying from the shop, dragging around in bags and leaving scattered across the island. So I expanded again. This time, I pushed out a new section of land and built a small peninsula away from the main yard. It was expensive, very expensive. Even with over $500,000, watching that money disappear into land still hurt. But once the ground was shaped and covered in grass, I finally had the space I needed. First, I placed pallet and bale storage. Somewhere to clean up the loose supplies and keep things organized. Then I added a fuel tank. Now the machines could finally be refilled right on the island. Then came fertilizer storage, and then came lime storage. And finally, seed storage. One by one, the support yard came together. Fuel, seeds, fertilizer, lime, storage. Everything the farm needed in one place. No more piles of bags scattered around the shop. No more fighting pallets in the yard. No more temporary setups. The island finally had the infrastructure to support everything I had built. By the end of the year, the old productions were gone, the field was fixed, the grape gardens had proven themselves, the soybean stockpile was growing, the pea gardens made more money than ever, and the new support yard gave the farm everything it needed. And now the farm needed one final piece: animals. The island had crops, it had gardens, it had storage, fuel, equipment, a house, and a full support yard. But if this place was really going to feel complete, it needed something living on it besides me. So I decided to add chickens. But before the chickens could move in, I needed food for them. And that meant using the field for something different. No soybeans this time. This field was going to grow sorghum. The planting window wasn't here yet, so for the moment, there wasn't much I could do with the field. The gardens were still running, the peas were stocked, and the grapes were already filling up again. So I waited. At least, I tried to wait. Because in January, the grapes created a problem. The gardens were full. They had produced so much that they had nowhere else to put the grapes, and I needed to clear space before the whole system backed up. My first thought was simple: load the grapes into the trailer and dump them into the silo. But the silo wouldn't take grapes. So now I had a trailer full of grapes, gardens that were still full, and nowhere convenient to put any of it, which meant I had to do it the old way, by hand. I started pulling grape pallets out one at a time, moving them away from the production area just to give the gardens room to keep working. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. I cleared enough space to keep the grapes from shutting down, left the trailer full, and went back to waiting for the right selling month. When May arrived, the field was ready for work. It wasn't perfect, there were weeds everywhere, and I had already gotten a little ahead of myself by filling the planter before remembering I still needed to cultivate. So I parked the planter, hooked up the cultivator, and got to work. The field had been through a lot by this point. Soybeans, lime, weeds, repairs, expansions, mistakes. But now it was being prepared for something new. Once the cultivation was done, I swapped back to the planter, filled it with seeds and fertilizer, changed it over to sorghum, and planted the field. Then I weeded it. It took most of the day, but by the time I finished, the field was planted, cleaned up, and ready to grow. Not fully optimized, I still needed a second fertilizer pass, but it was good enough to feed the chickens once the crop came in. With the field handled, I could finally empty the grapes. The trailer had been sitting there full for months, and now May was the right time to sell. So I hauled the first load to the sell point and cashed it in. Over $40,000 from the first trailer. Then I started working through the rest. The loose pallets, the gardens, everything that had stacked up while I was waiting. Load after load went into the sell point, and by the time the grape sale was finished, I had almost $400,000 in the bank. That gave me plenty of room to finish the island properly. Before I spent it though, I cleaned up the support systems. The fertilizer storage was full and I still had loose supplies sitting around, so I started moving everything where it belonged. Solid fertilizer went into the gardens, then seeds. The support yard made the process easier, but the gardens still needed a lot. 4 large gardens, each one capable of holding 20,000 liters of inputs. That was a lot of filling. But this was exactly why I built the support yard in the first place. Instead of buying bags from the shop and fighting with pallets, I could load from storage, haul it over, and keep the productions running. So I filled the gardens. Fertilizer first, then seeds, one garden after another until everything was topped up. After that came water. This was still the biggest grind on the island. 250,000 liters every year, 2,000 liters at a time. I filled the tank, hauled it to the gardens, dumped it in, and kept repeating the loop until every garden was full again. By the time I finished, the crops had everything they needed. The grapes were reset, the peas were ready to produce, the support yard was being used, and the island was still making money. With the productions handled, I used some of that money to clean up the shape of the island. There were still rough edges, awkward corners, sections that didn't really look finished. So I expanded and smoothed the land one more time, rounding out the edges and making the whole place feel more like an actual island instead of a patchwork of emergency expansions. It was late by the time I finished, but the island looked better, cleaner, more complete. The next month, it was finally time to sell the soybeans. I had been saving them for years, stacking every harvest in the silo instead of selling small loads. Now the stockpile was finally big enough to feel worth it. I loaded the trailer with over 12,000 liters of soybeans and hauled it to the sell point. It wasn't the biggest sale the island had ever seen, but it brought in over $41,000. That was enough to make the next upgrade happen. The little trailer, it kinda had to go. It had helped for a long time, but it was too small now. Especially with chickens coming in, I needed a better way to move pallets and eggs. At first, I thought I could just convert my current trailer into something that would work, but I couldn't. So I bought a new one, a proper flatbed trailer. Something that could actually handle pallets, eggs, whatever else the farm needed to move. Then I bought a forklift, a dedicated machine for loading pallets. No more trying to make the wrong tools do the job, no more fighting the awkward setups. If the chickens were going to produce eggs, I wanted the farm ready to handle them properly. The forklift got parked in the barn. The new trailer got moved over by the storage area. And just like that, the farm had another proper logistics upgrade. Not flashy, but useful. Now I just needed the crop. September arrived and the sorghum was ready. The fields hadn't been fertilized as well as it should have been. I missed the second pass, and by the time I realized it, the crops were already too far along to drive over without damaging them. So the yield wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. This wasn't a cash crop, this was chicken feed. I pulled the harvester out, hooked up the header, and started cutting the first sorghum harvest. The field gave me just under 7,000 liters. Not amazing, but enough to get the chickens started. I dumped the sorghum into storage and waited for December. Because before I built the chicken area, I wanted one more big pea sale. When winter came, the pea gardens were ready. I hooked up the trailer and started selling. Trip after trip, load after load. The peas did what they always did. They turned months of waiting into a massive pile of cash. By the time the last load was gone, I had almost $400,000 again. That was more than enough to finish the farm. The first thing I did was clean up some leftover sand and grass in the area where the chickens were going to go. Then, I picked the top side of the island for the coops. I didn't want to go overboard. The field was only so big and it was going to be the main thing feeding them. So instead of building some massive chicken operation, I kept it reasonable. 2 chicken coops. 60 chickens total. Enough to bring animals onto the island without turning the whole farm into an egg factory. I placed the coops, lined them up with the rest of the farm, and filled both with chickens. And just like that, the island had animals. After that, I really wanted the farm to look finished, so I put in a small road system. Nothing too fancy, just enough to connect the main areas, clean up the yard, and make the island feel more built out. Then, I added another shed, a place for trailers, a place for equipment, one more little structure to make the farm feel complete. With the coops placed and the yard cleaned up, there was only one thing left to do: feed the chickens. I loaded the sorghum from the silo, backed up to the first coop, and filled it with feed. Then I moved to the second coop and split the rest between them. The chickens had food. The field had a purpose. The gardens were producing. The grape system was working. The pea system was still the moneymaker, and the barn was full of equipment. The support yard was stocked. The house was sitting behind it all, and the island finally had everything it needed. This place started as nothing but water and one tiny piece of land. Then it became a place to survive, then a place to make money, and then a farm. And now it was complete. A deep sea island with crops, animals, storage, equipment, productions, roads, a home, and systems that all worked together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the biggest farm in the world, but it was built from nothing. Every piece of land had to be earned. Every machine had to be bought one sale at a time. Every system came from solving the problem before it. After all those years in the deep sea, the island was finally finished.